I wanted to start this evening, really with the reflection, and in good Catholic tradition, start with a couple of sources, one from Scripture and one from Pope Francis himself, that I'm going to use to frame my remarks tonight. Two things I'd like us to just keep in mind as we think our way through these issues. The first is from Deuteronomy 10:19. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt, which is the theme of the morning prayer tomorrow morning. So I would admit that I stole it from your reflection tomorrow. I think that theme of what binds us together as humans and what separates us into us and them, what brings us to other people, is something we need to reflect on as we think about policy choices we make to support temporary migrant workers. The second homily, I guess, is from Pope Francis in Laudato Si at 206, where he said, "Purchasing is always a moral and not simply an economic act." And I just want us to hold those two things in our mind and think about what it might mean when we bring them together. So if we rely on strangers to create the value that we're purchasing to pick the broccoli that perhaps we were just eating, that's a moral act, not simply an economic one. But if we continue to treat them as strangers and not as guests in our country, in our home, where does that leave us? Where do we end up as a society if we bring people into our home for an extended period and don't look after them as whole human beings, but treat them essentially permanently as simply economic inputs into an industrial machine? That's really what I want to reflect on tonight. I would be amiss if I didn't start also when we're thinking about strangers and the political economy of this country with where we are. And I want to acknowledge that we're on Wurundjeri country. And the development of that country over the last 200 years has really been tied up with the process of strangers finding their way here and extracting what we call value in our political economic system, with a whole host of externalities being created environmentally and socially, and often the labour that was involved in the production of value in our society was, let's call it, not entirely voluntary. So it started, of course, with convict labour, not entirely voluntary labour. Many of those people probably thought that they were temporary migrant workers, although they wouldn't have used that labour, but they thought they were going home. Then we have the process of the assimilation of First Nations peoples into the workforce to develop pastoral economy, in domestic servitude, in pearling, fishing on the northwest coast of Australia, and all of the downside risks. I'm going to keep using that economic language for a deliberate reason. Those downside risks that imposed on First Nations peoples, because we treated them as fungible inputs into an economic system rather than thinking about the whole economic impact and the social impact. And in some cases, those experiences of First Nations peoples were what we would today call modern slavery. They amounted to what we would now classify as domestic or sexual servitude, forced labour, debt bondage in some situations, certainly deceptive recruiting. These are all offences under Commonwealth criminal law these days. Conducted often under colour of law when they occurred, but nonetheless, certainly not entirely voluntary labour. And then in the middle of the 19th century, we stopped bringing convicts here. And there was a bit of a flirt in Western Australia with the idea of bringing out indentured labourers from Mauritius and South Asia, but that didn't really get off the ground. And we found that the structurally forced labour of First Nations people wasn't necessarily giving us the depth of labour force that we needed. So what happened? Well, over the next 50 years or so, from the 1860s to the early part of the 20th century, a according to the Human Rights Commission, 62,000 South Sea Islanders were kidnapped from South Pacific and brought to the area where I now live, Bundjalung country in northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, initially to try and develop a cotton industry because of the disruption of the global cotton market as a result of the American Civil War, but that didn't really work out, so instead it became a sugar industry. And some of the wealth that continues to flow through our institutions, our universities, the ASX and those things, has been generated by that kind of not entirely voluntary labour. People who were brought here often against their will or under conditions of deception, manipulation, including from the same South Pacific islands that we now look to send us workers to support our economy in so many important ways. Then there was a bit of a hiatus in Australia because the backlash to some of that migration policy led to what we now know as the White Australia policy and a crackdown on the reliance of foreign labour, and partly because of a union reaction, has to be acknowledged. So for about the first half of the 20th century, we didn't really rely on migrant labour in the same way, but then in the post-war period there was a return to reliance on migrant labour, but immigration. These were people brought here not as temporary migrant workers, but to become part of Australian society, and the tradition of multiculturalism and the tradition of welcoming strangers that we've really built up, that we've built our institutions around in this country. It largely draws from that period, from the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when we were bringing migrants into this country, later refugees, we were welcoming them for the long term. What we haven't had such a clear conversation about is guest workers. We don't have a tradition, we like to believe in this country, of large-scale reliance on guest worker populations. And yet I would argue over the last 20 years, without a big organised public debate, that's really the policy settings that we've adopted in a number of important areas of our economy, including notably agriculture, horticulture, also meat processing increasingly, and now there's a turn to rely increasingly on foreign workers here temporarily in aged care settings as well. We have large groups of guest workers in this country now, often for quite extended periods, as Professor Berg was explaining this morning. It's probably up somewhere around 1 million people. 700,000 international students, most of whom do some kind of work that's quite important to certain sectors of our economy, such as hospitality and low-paid retail. We have palm workers, 30,000, 32,000, I think you said, Kerry. But with the expansion, might head a bit north of that. Is that fair to guess? Yeah, heading a little bit north. Working holiday makers and other skilled workers, of course. So we have these guest communities living amongst us. And I think we have to ask ourselves, how do we treat them? I would say in many cases we treat them well. Otherwise there wouldn't be so many coming. There are win-win-wins from schemes such as the Palm scheme. It's a win for the workers who can generate income. It's a win for the communities and families that they can send that home to. We know that families that receive remittances from the Palm and similar schemes have rising income at a household level, improved social and health outcomes for women, for example, in those contexts. And it's a win for the host communities because it feeds prosperity, particularly in rural and regional Australia. But that's not always the story. Occasionally, and it's probably a minority of cases, but occasionally we don't treat our guests so well. And so I wanted to tell you about 3 or 4 temporary migrant workers that I've got to know over the last year through the performance of my function. So for those of you who don't know, I'm the New South Wales Anti-Slavery Commissioner. That's an independent statutory office. So I was appointed under a new law that came into force a few years ago. I'm the first person in the role. I report to the Parliament of New South Wales, not to the executive government. And I have various functions under that law, including providing support and assistance to victims of modern slavery. So we get an increasing number of people reporting to us for that support and assistance. because I have wide discretion under the law where I refer the support and assistance. I don't have to refer them to police or to immigration. I do have mandatory reporting responsibilities for children, but for adults, we only refer with consent. So we find increasing numbers of people coming forward to engage us directly. At the moment, we've only been running this for about a year, and at the moment it's about 4 people for specific matters of modern slavery new each week. On the current rate, and that's without advertising our service, on the current rate, that's about as many reports as the AFP, Australian Federal Police, gets from New South Wales each year, and we think that's going to go up as we start building out and advertising that service. So I wanted to tell you about 3 or 4 people, temporary migrant workers, that we provided support and assistance to over the last few months, because I think it helps bring to life the challenges that we face here in ensuring that we look after our guests effectively. The first one I'm going to call Joel, who's a fisherman who came to this country on a specialist worker visa. And what I'm going to tell you here is obviously de-identified for obvious reasons, to protect privacy and safety and security. And here and there I've adjusted the facts also for safety, but essentially these are the outlines of 4 live matters with the books currently. So Joel came to fish on an Australian vessel. And when he got here, he found that essentially he had been deceptively recruited and that the conditions he was working under were highly abusive. He had to work a lot of overtime unpaid. He didn't get proper pay. He said he wasn't given his entitlements. He was suffering intimidation and abuse. And increasingly he was concerned for his own safety. Now, it turns out that the employer that Joel ended up in the hands of appears to have links to organised crime. And that this became clear to Joel, his fears for his co-workers' safety only grew, you can imagine. So it was actually through the church that Joel found support and assistance initially. It was co-parishioners. He was allowed to attend church, and it was through co-parishioners that he was able to express his fears and the abuse he was suffering, and found his way to us. And with his consent, and given some other things that were happening to him, including abuse and intimidation of his family, imposition of new debts on his family in his home country, with his consent, we reported the matter to police. The police raided the vessel in the middle of the night. They interviewed Joel and other workers within earshot of the alleged perpetrators, and they determined that there was no modern slavery present. Now, when we look at this fact base and look at the ILO's 11 forced indicators, we think that this is fairly clearly that there are reasonable grounds to investigate a matter of modern slavery. And the police, I don't have investigative power, I don't have investigative capability, the police do. And their conclusion was that there was no modern slavery offence. So they left Joel and his co-workers on the boat. As a result, afterwards, they suffered a significant increase in physical and psychological intimidation and abuse. It got to the point that Joel was suicidal and feared for his life. So we were able then to connect him to a very important Catholic organisation, Mission to Seafarers, which has done wonderful work with him and his co-workers since to provide pastoral and spiritual support. And working with them, we've been able to connect Joel and his co-workers to unions, other relevant government authorities, both in New South Wales and federally, and legal support. Joel isn't yet out of harm's way. The matter continues. And the system, he faces challenges in trusting the system increasingly, because he's put himself, as he sees it, in harm's way to get support and assistance, and he doesn't feel that he's received it effectively. Let me tell you about another person I've met over the last few months who I'm going to call Jenny. Jenny's an international student from Africa. She entered into a relationship with a man on the internet who encouraged her to come to Australia and study, and told her he would support her when she got here. She has an ailing mother in her home country in Africa, and she decided if she came here, she could make a new life for herself, earn some money and set at home. When she got here, she realised that actually the man expected her to engage in sex work. She had no background in sex work, and to give a large percentage of the fee she earned to him. She was engaged. She was in Australia under an international student visa, and she was enrolled in a course at the university. When she disclosed these matters to the university, she didn't get assistance. Instead, she was investigated for breaching her working arrangements and conditions of attendance at the university. Things spiraled, and she ended up in a situation of drug and alcohol abuse. She managed to transfer universities, but found it increasingly difficult to... she did manage to exit from the relationship with the man, but she found it increasingly difficult to keep up with her studies without engaging in what she found very humiliating sex work. She had not... We do have many stakeholders that engage voluntarily in sex work, which of course in New South Wales is perfectly legal. But Jenny was not one of those people who had originally entered sex work voluntarily, but she felt that she had no other way within the bounds of the visa to make the payments to pay for doing the steep rent in Sydney, to pay to live independently and stay away from the violent relationship that she found herself in. She eventually found her way onto the Support to Trafficked People program, and again it was a church organisation that helped make that happen. But she's continued to find it difficult to find remedy and healing. She has a continuing struggle with alcoholism and drug dependency, and she has long ago timed out of the supports that the Support to Trafficked People program provides. And although she's applied to things like the New South Wales Victims' Rights Support Scheme, they're unable, that scheme is not set up to provide the long-term support, counselling, healthcare services that victims of modern slavery that have suffered a fundamental blow to their agency, sense of control of their own choices in their life, often suffer. A third person I've met in the last few months I'm going to call Isaac. So Isaac was recruited through the PALM scheme by a company that many of you will know the name of, called Links, Tasmania, Pty Ltd. He alleges that he was exploited by Links. He managed to disengage from that program and then ended up moving around the country working informally, essentially in breach of his visa requirements. And then he heard about some of the great things going on in the Western Riverina in New South Wales, greater than Leadley, and the kinds of support people were being given there. So he made his way to that area, and that's where he got in touch with us through intermediaries, and we've been providing him support and assistance for the last few months. That support and assistance includes essentially finding a new place for him to live every week or two, usually in a church or at the charity of strangers. We have to move him around because he's not qualified, because he's not a victim of domestic violence or various other things. He's not qualified for the kinds of support that are available, and they're not very extensive out there in Western Riverina. He's not. He has no access to lawful income, so he has no access to food. So he's living off food vouchers that we and others are able to rustle up for him, and through handouts of hampers. He had all his belongings stolen about 10 days ago from the place he was living in a church, which was pretty frustrating and disappointing. And he's entirely dependent on the charity of others to make his way out of this situation. I want to mention one final temporary migrant worker that I got to know in the last few months, who I'm going to call Latifa, who's another temporary migrant worker in the country through the PALM scheme. And Latifa is a bit emblematic of a series of reports that we've received over the last few months from the New South Wales Police and health authorities. Latifa came here and was working fairly happily up around the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and then had what I'm going to call an unplanned pregnancy. It's not quite clear how the pregnancy came about, what level of consent was involved, whether there was alcohol or coercion involved. But the key thing is that essentially that led to a collapse of her control over her own life, her agency in that situation. Her life was taken control of by others. She began to be moved around, and she first really came to the attention of the authorities when she showed up in Leeton to give birth, having received no antenatal care. Because having become pregnant and disengaged from her employer, she was essentially not able to access healthcare. A number of further complexities then entered the story, with different community members seeking to claim custody of the child, including community members who had no apparent familial relationship with Latifa. And police, healthcare, and child protection all struggling to make head and tail of the situation, figure out what the appropriate steps were, which is how we came to be brought in. So what's common to these cases? I would say a couple of things. First of all, this is all about people who have fallen through the cracks. This is not about the system working as it's intended to work. It's about what goes wrong when the system goes wrong. And we don't have the scenarios for providing people support in those situations. That's often because they've disengaged from the formal pathways that we've set up for one reason or another. And what happens in that case is, as you've seen from all of these stories, they become silenced. They lose their sense of agency over their own life, and that's deeply, deeply traumatizing. And it often means that they do need others to step in as advocates, as providers of moral and pastoral support. And the kinds of pastoral support that many of you are providing, I would argue, are quite literally life-saving. In many of the instances I've talked about, it has been that local, on-the-ground pastoral support, not only to provide access to basic needs and services, shelter, food, clothing, but also just to be seen as a human being by others and not just as a bureaucratic problem to be solved. That's really kept a lot of these people going day to day. But the other thing I would say here is that what's common about those solutions is that that pastoral care is being provided generally as an act of charity, to pick up on Archbishop's comments earlier today, by Good Samaritans. And I would say that that's both wonderful and deeply problematic. It's wonderful because it's an act of grace, and it's deeply problematic because at the scale of the population of guest workers that we now rely on, we should be planning for these situations. We should expect them to happen. These should not be unexpected crises that we have to tend to through humanitarian response. We should have the resources and capabilities as governments, as societies, as businesses, as civil society that are there pre-positioned so that people have the support and assistance they need when they need it. It's a choice not to plan for these situations. It's a choice to make the working justice visa available to everyone but farm workers. It's a choice to rely on employers to provide pastoral care and then shrug when they don't. It's a choice not to proactively inform state and local councils where workers will be, where they will be coming from, and then to ensure that we have adequate interpretation available to support them. TIA's, the National Interpreter Agency provided through Department of Home Affairs, currently provides access, at least in New South Wales, which is the case I know, to one interpreter in Islam, the main language from Vanuatu, which represents 25% of the Palm workforce. And he's male. So if you're female, if you're Ni Vanuatu female working here and you need to talk to somebody, myself, a lawyer, whoever else, about sexual violence, for example, you have to do it through a man. Culturally, this is deeply inappropriate. It's preventing people reporting, it's preventing people getting the kinds of support that they need. So why are we making these kinds of choices? I would say there's at least two reasons that I can see. The first is that we've adopted what I would call an industrial logic. The palm is really a relationship that's been developed between Canberra and industry. When you look at the rhetoric around it, at least until very recently, the focus has been on meeting workforce needs of industry in rural and regional Australia. And that's important. But what it means with that industrial focus is that there's an assumption that we can just bracket off the socio-economic questions and where the externalities fall. But we can't. They'll come back to us. They'll come back to haunt us in decreased legitimacy of the program, both in local communities that are having to deal with the consequences of these problems and in sending communities that are going to hear the stories about how a minority of palm workers, yes, I say it again, it's a minority, and overall the scheme has very positive benefits. But the downside risk from a small group having really terrible experiences would really affect the strategic objectives that we're trying to achieve through this scheme, of building closer relationships with our neighbours in the region, not strangers, neighbours, who are here as our guests. And I think the second reason we've made this choice is that we've basically just failed to be honest with ourselves as a nation about our growing reliance on guest workers. We have not had a national conversation about how the reliance on guest workers incentivises our reliance on exploitation to reduce labour costs, and how that connects to our own behaviour as consumers, our reliance on certain market structures in, say, the food industry. We haven't had that conversation. There's no reason we can't, there's no reason we shouldn't, I don't think we have. So what can we do about it? This is what I want to leave you with. I would say there are roughly 5 things I can think of. The first is we can mobilise and organise. While we continue to treat these issues as a question of charity, of good Samaritan behaviour, we will all be fragmented. We need to organise and think about power of the collective here and how that can shift debate amongst society and debate in government. And it's not just up to community service providers and churches. There are other actors to enlist here too. So there's an important new mayoral alliance emerging, for example, in New South Wales, amongst mayors who are in charge of communities that are dealing with these challenges because they face common challenges. Secondly, we need to recruit the public. What I mean by that is we need to tell them human stories so they don't see temporary migrant workers as alien others, just economic widgets into an economic machine, but actually recognise these people as humans and bring out the best behaviour in the public. It's possible to do. I would say that the refugee policy debate in this country was transformed over the last 20 years by a concerted effort to humanise refugees. Think of the family from Biloela. That kind of humanisation is essential to getting people to treat others not as others, but as part of our region, as our neighbours, as our friends, and to do their best for them. So we need to know more about Jenny and Joel and Isaac and Latifa, and also about the people who aren't having those negative experiences, but the positive experiences. And as was said this morning, the best way to do that is to give voice and agency to the workers themselves, not just to tell their stories, but actually to be part of the process of co-design, co-delivery of solutions. The third thing I'd say is we need to think at the system level. We can't just tinker with this program here or that program there. The stronger regulation gets around palm, the more we're going to see agricultural and horticultural companies relying on working holiday makers again, or on other temporary migrant workers that are perhaps less protected. So solutions like the worker justice visa that help create a floor of protections of which everyone can stand are going to be critical, but it needs to be applying across the board. We can't have carve-outs like the palm scheme there. Fourth, I would say we do need to engage big business. these schemes are built around economic puzzles and economic problems. We need big business to be at the table to protect their legitimacy going forward. And I think you'll find that framed the right way, that won't be a hard sell to business. Their long-term interests are to have successful programs here that allow long-term engagement with workers from our region and from further abroad, and that ensure suitable supplies of labour. And to do that, they need to invest in the human beings that ultimately represent that labour. And that brings me back to Pope Francis's point that purchasing is always a moral and not simply an economic act. We need to have those with purchasing power in the market, big business at the table to fashion solutions. And then finally, I would say we need to do what you're already doing. We do have to think systemic, we do have to think global in that sense, but we have to act local. The immediate problems continue to be here and now on the ground in your communities. The work you're all doing to provide pastoral support and care to the human beings that are living amongst us, the guests living amongst us, is absolutely crucial. I commend you for it. Please continue, and we hope to provide support and assistance as we move forward. Thank you so much.